All right. Hello, folks. Welcome to another of our recorded lectures for pre-Civil War American Lit or American Literature 1, um, our survey course. We are still in early American literature, pre-19th century stuff, and today we are going to look at poetry, which is exciting. And the first two poets that we read in this class are Anne Bradstreet and Phillis Wheatley. So, for this lecture, I'd like to ask you to start by actually answering a question. So pause the lecture and answer this first question. What is your experience with and or your feelings about poetry? So take a moment and answer that question and then continue the lecture. Okay, now that you're back, couple of slides about reading poetry in general before I talk about a particular poem each from Wheatley and Bradstreet. So I mentioned in class, and I'm going to repeat it here again, the distinction between speaker and author. So when we talk about the author, we're talking about the real life person who penned a poem or a novel or any kind of text, right? So the author of On Being Brought from Africa to America is Phillis Wheatley. The author of Prologue is Anne Bradstreet. Within a poem specifically, the speaker is the kind of fictionalized voice that we can imagine saying the poem, as if the poem is a spoken utterance. So whenever you see the pronoun I, right? I see, I pray, I ask. I want you to suspend for a moment when you're reading poetry your knowledge of who the author is and try to encounter the speaker as a fictional construction. For a lot of poets, the speaker and the author are the same person. The speaker is the author. But for many other poets, the speaker is a fictionalized account, not the author themselves. So keep that in mind. Connected to that is a big vocab word in literature classes and in literary criticism or literary studies in general, and that is the intentional fallacy. So you all know that a fallacy is, of course, something that you do that is incorrect or a mistake. The intentional fallacy in literary interpretation refers to the assumption that the author's intended meaning is the definitive meaning of a text. And so that is a fallacy, meaning one ought not to assume that the meaning of a text is what the author intended. So the point here is not to ignore, right, the author's intention. The author's intention matters, right? It matters that, to use a famous example, George Orwell wrote 1984 as a critique of totalitarianism, and that George Orwell was himself a socialist. So when some people assert that 1984 is an anti-socialism or anti-progressive or anti like I don't know, like anti-left wing kind of novel, that goes against the author's own intended meanings for the novel. Now, that doesn't mean such an interpretation would be wrong, right? That's the thing. The fallacy is to assume that the author's intentions are what the text means. We consider the author's intentions. The author's intentions matter, but they are one thing that matters among a constellation of other factors, right? So when we're talking about the author and we're thinking about autobiography, the point here is not to ignore the author's autobiography, but instead the point is to resist the urge that a lot of us feel to grant the author's autobiography a special or elevated position in determining the meaning of a literary text. So just because the author experienced something in their own lives, you don't want to read everything they ever wrote as an expression of that personal experience, right? That experience matters, but it doesn't overdetermine our readings. And then you can read the other kind of points on this slide on your own. Um, quick vocab for us. Hermeneutics is a big word that simply refers to what a text means. So 1984 is a novel about the dangers of authoritarianism. That's a hermeneutic claim. It's a claim about what a text means or what it does. Poetics is a term that is not just for poetry. Any literary text can be referred to in terms of poetics, Poetics refers to how a text produces meaning. So later in this lecture, I'm going to be doing some close reading of some poetry, and I'm going to talk about things like rhyme and meter, and you can think of other terms that you know, like symbolism and irony and metaphor. Poetics refers to the stuff that the language does in order to produce meaning, how the text works. So hermeneutics, you could think what, and poetics, you could think how. And as you can see on the slide, for poetry, you always want to think in terms of sound as well as sight. So you should absolutely read poetry aloud. Absolutely read poetry aloud. Do it. That is like a command in this class if you can. Okay. And then a quick note that all texts exist in context. And context could be historical context. When was this written? Autobiographical context, who was this author and how is their life experience influencing their writing? Intertextual context, is the writer responding to a text? Aesthetic context, was the writer part of a larger aesthetic movement like naturalism or modernism or postmodernism or magical realism? Are we talking about a filmmaker during a certain moment where superhero films have a certain kind of aesthetic? So that context matters. Political context, was this writer writing against censorship at the time? Material context, meaning was this author wealthy enough to kind of do their writing and whatever they wanted, or were they poor and trying to make money, and does that influence how they're choosing to write in a way that might appeal to like a more popular audience? And historiographical context. Historiography is different from just history. Historiographical context refers not just to the time in which the author lived or the text was published, but the reception of the text over time. This semester we're reading Herman Melville, and a historiographical context of Melville is that in his time he was really praised for one of his novels, Moby Dick. Um, oh, sorry, Typee before Moby Dick, and then after Typee, which is one of his earliest novels, he really falls off in popular favor and is recovered in the 1950s as a great author. And so the historiography refers to the history of the afterlife of a text or an author. So all of those contexts matter in how we encounter texts. And finally, this is really important. Literary interpretation is not a treasure hunt where you're off and you're searching for all of the clues, or you're searching for, I found this metaphor, I found this symbol, I found this irony, and now that I found this treasure, I present it to you. Instead, literary interpretation is a creative act of exploration where you are engaging with the text and you're putting things together to show how you can produce a reading of a text. And I'm going to show you a little bit about how to do that in the next 10 minutes or so with a couple of poems. So first, Phillis Wheatley's very short on being brought from Africa to America. So I can read the whole poem at once because it's a short poem. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught me my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train." So a couple things to notice. First, there's a rhyme scheme. A, B, B, C, C, D, D, meaning the last word of each, the last syllable of each line rhymes with the next line. That produces what are called couplets. Couplets refers to a pair of rhyming lines of poetry. And these particular couplets are called heroic couplets because not only do they rhyme, but they're also written in what's called iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter refers to the meter of the poem. So poems sometimes have rhymes, sometimes they have meter. The meter is an iambic pentameter, which means there are five penta, right? Like a pentagram is five signs. There are five um, iambic. An iamb is a pair of stressed and unstressed syllables. So 'twas mercy brought me from my pagan land. You can hear I arrive at stresses, right? And so there are 10 syllables total. The 10 syllables are divided by 5 pairs of a stressed and an unstressed syllable. Um, may be refined and join the angelic train, right? You can kind of go through yourself and hear that. The thing that I really want to get to with this poem, though, is the most famous thing about this poem, as short as it is that for centuries, readers have argued about the definitive meaning of the poem because of a single line, this bolded line here. Remember Christians, Negroes, black as Cain. And that line is interesting because it's ambiguous because of the commas. So you can read this line first as remember, comma, Christians, comma. So the speaker is talking to Christians. Remember, you Christians, Negroes who are as black as Cain, Cain being the uh brother who commits the first murder in the Old Testament, and some Christians at the time believed that black people, Africans, were the descendants of Cain and were marked by black skin because they're the descendants of the first murderer, and so that justified slavery. So you could read this line as the speaker saying, "Remember, Christians," and that commas being a parenthetical address. So Christians are being addressed. Negroes, and then this parenthetical, black as Cain. So people who are as black as Cain, right, may be refined and join the angelic train. So remember, you Christians, African people can actually join you in heaven. Or you could read it as, remember, Christians, um, and then you can say here that the speaker's addressing fellow black people with this parenthetical, and saying Christians address black as Cain may be refined. So they might be reversing it depending on who's being addressed, and saying that Christians are the ones who, because of their improper treatment of Africans, their sinful treatment through slavery, they might be the ones who are as black as Cain. Um, or you can even read it in other ways, depending on how you interpret all of these nested parenthetical clauses, right? Who is being addressed? Who is black as Cain? Who is in need of refinement? These are questions that the poem doesn't answer. And so for centuries, readers have argued about how we should read this poem based on this brilliantly ambiguous bolded line. So my question for you, all of you, if you want to answer it, is how do you read this poem? Who do you think the speaker is addressing? How does your interpretation align with that second to last line and who you think the speaker is addressing and what they're saying? I don't know what the definitive, I'm the professor, but I don't know what the definitive answer is. I want to know how you read it. What do you think? And why do you think that? Okay, and the second poem I want to go through is Anne Bradstreet's prologue, which is much longer. I am not going to go through every single stanza. And in fact, I actually am not lying. I have a document saved that is a 2,300 word long document where I go through stanza by stanza and do a close reading of this poem. Um, as a demonstration for students who have taken this class with me in previous semesters. I'm not going to do that with y'all because I don't want to make this lecture 45 minutes long. But instead, I'm going to go through a few of the stanzas and I'm going to offer you a kind of TLDR, quick and dirty reading of the poem and invite you to fill in the blanks by going back and reading the other stanzas. So in this first stanza, to sing of wars, of captains, and of kings, of cities founded, commonwealths begun, for my mean pen are two superior things, or how they all, or each their dates have run. Let poets and historians set these forth, my obscure lines shall not so dim their worth. So here we have a different rhyme scheme, A, B, A, B, C, C. Again, kings, things, begun, run, and then fourth worth being a what's called imperfect rhyme, because you have to kind of fudge the pronunciation and make it like firth and worth in order to get it to rhyme. And so you have this again, iambic pentameter, again, rhyming lines, but only one couplet at the end. The others have an A B rhyme scheme, right? So we're setting up all these things here. And just quickly pointing out that the word mean here has an archaic meaning as crude. And so here in this first stanza, the poet seems to be saying that her own crude pen can't write about wars and captains and kiddings and the founding of cities and founding of commonwealths because those things are too superior for her. Her pen is too crude to write about those things. Instead, she says, let the great poets and historians write about those things. I'm gonna write my obscure lines, my poet lines, my poetry lines are not so good, and so I don't want to dim the worth of these great things with my obscure lines, my crude pen, right? So there's self-deprecation happening in this first stanza. Later she says, nor can I, like the fluent, sweet-tongued Greek, who lisped at first in future times speak plain. And here we have an allusion to the Greek rhetorician Demosthenes, who was widely recognized in Bradstreet's time as ancient Greece's greatest political orator. And so here she pens a stanza that refers to the greatest orator of ancient Greece who very famously had a lisp. And in that, she pens a stanza that would actually be very difficult for Demosthenes to read because of all the S sounds. And you can even hear not only are there multiple S sounds in terms of frequency, but in how they come together. So in future times speak, that times speak, the S and the S back to back flow into each other. That's a very difficult sound for someone with a lisp to say out loud. And so she actually makes a stanza that is hard for the very person she is alluding to read, right? So keep listening for sounds like that. A few stanzas down, she says, but sure the antique Greeks were far more mild. And here we have what's called internal rhyme, antique Greeks, right? Where the rhyme happens inside of the line. We also have here the first time in the poem where the poet at the level of denotation, and when we say denotation, what I mean is the literal dictionary meaning of words, starts to argue against the idea that men are better poets than women. So up until this point, the denotative meaning of the poem was that the speaker as a woman wasn't a good enough poet to write about big, great themes of history, and that the great men poets of history were the ones who should write about these great things. But here, finally, we have at the level of denotation, which is again literal meaning, the poet is saying, but the ancient Greeks made Calliope the personification of poesy or poetry. Calliope was a female muse, a woman muse. And if the ancient Greeks said poetry came from a woman, then how is it? And we all agree that the ancient Greeks are the best poets. How is it that we would denigrate women's poetry? That's silly. So here we have the first moment in the poem where the poet at the level of denotation is no longer self-deprecating, no longer saying my pen is too crude, but is instead saying, actually, historically, the Greeks said that poetry came from a woman muse. What's going on here? And then we get the very first direct address of the poem when she says here, let Greeks be Greeks and women what they are. Men have precedency and still excel. It is but vain unjustly to wage war. Men can do best and women know it well. Preeminence in all and each is yours. Direct address to men. Preeminence in all and each is yours. So you, men, are the best at waging war. You, men, have precedency. You excel. So please just grant some small acknowledgement of what we small, less great women can do. You can hear the irony start to build here, this self-deprecation, right? And then in this final stanza, you have what I consider to be one of the most brilliantly skillful stanzas in all of Western poetry here. And oh, ye high-flown quills that soar the skies, and ever with your prey still catch your praise, if e'er you deign to these lowly lines your eyes, give time or parsley wreath, I ask no bays. This mean and unrefined ore of mine will make your glistering gold but more to shine. This is just dripping with irony at this point, because what she does here in just the first line is she mixes two of the most difficult and complex poetic devices, synecdoche and metonymy, together in the word quills. So synecdoche is when a part stands in for a whole, like when you say, I need some hands to mean I need some laborers. In this case, quills refers to birds. Quills are standing in for birds, as synecdoche. At the same time, this is metonymy, which is when something associated with a noun stands in for the noun itself, like when we say the crown in order to stand in for the king or the royal family. Here, not only is quills a synecdoche for birds because quills are parts for the whole that is birds, but quills stands in for writing because quills is the object, the noun that great poets use to make their poetry. So quills here is both synecdoche and metonymy at the same time. There's also this brilliant pun of pray and praise, right? Where that imperfect rhyme is also a pun on how these birds, these male poets, prey on praise. They capture praise like birds of prey, right? And so all of this in this stanza, and there's more going on here that I'm not going to get into because I don't want to make this lecture even longer than it already is. So there's even more going on here. Like getting thyme or parsley, right? These kitchen spices. But that that what's happening in this final stanza is a beautiful demonstration of skill in the exact moment that the denotation of the words is that the speaker is saying, my crude, unrefined ore, my poetry, which is unrefined, which is not so good, which is raw and crude, really just serves to show how great and beautiful your golden poetry is, right? So denotatively, she's saying my crude poetry, my not very good poetry stands to make yours seem better by contrast. But because of what the poem has done throughout, and I've not gone through all of it again, I want to keep this lecture below 25 minutes. But what this poem has done throughout is through its absolute mastery of poetic skill has actually undermined its denotative content with its brilliant form. And so if I were to write a paper about this poem where I give a close reading of prologue, my thesis statement would be through Bradstreet's skillful use of poetic devices such as synecdoche, metonymy, internal rhyme, imperfect rhyme, and allusion, the form of her poem winds up undermining the denotative content in order to argue for or in order to argue against sexist prejudices against women poets, right? That's just off the top of my head. It's a little imperfect, a little clunky of a sentence, but generally that's kind of what I'm offering as a reading of this poem. There are other ways to read the poem. Some people read this poem as addressed to other like specific interlocutors rather than just kind of male poets. So there's other ways to read it. I'm not giving the one and only way to read it. I'm just offering a quick and dirty look at how you could read this poem. And so I end with this question for you at the end. What is your takeaway from my very quick close readings of these two poems? How does your feeling at this moment, after you've kind of heard me talk through all of the things that these poems are doing and how they're ambiguous and how they're ironic and all these different things, how does your feeling at this moment compare with your response to the very first question at the beginning of the lecture? So, looking forward to talking with y'all more about poetry as the semester goes on.